This story begins with the voice of Arthur Riley, the pastor of the Mount Calvary Church, who decides to record a message on an audio tape for his daughter, Naomi. In the recording, Arthur presents himself not only as a man of God, but also as a father and future grandfather, making it clear that if anyone other than his daughter is listening to these words, it is probably because they also need to know what he has to confess. He warns them in a grave tone that if they have found this recording, it means the rats have returned and they must be very careful. In his final message, Arthur confesses that, despite having taught about God's laws and the difference between good and evil, he committed the ultimate sin by taking the life of a man named Royce Cobb. He explains that he did it believing it was the right thing to do to protect the children and future generations from something terrible, and reveals that he buried the body right there, assuring them it won't be hard to find for whoever needs it. We then cut to the present, where we see Naomi, Arthur's daughter, trying to make a living with her music. After a performance at a bar, she feels frustrated because the audience seems indifferent to her new songs and only wants to hear tracks from a decade ago. Although someone close tries to encourage her, saying her new album is inspiring and she shouldn't give up over the reaction of some random bar, she remains skeptical and discouraged. Her reality changes drastically the next morning when her son, Dylan, calls for her insistently. While she prepares breakfast, the boy complains about the babysitter from the night before and expresses his unhappiness with their current home, begging her to move back to California. Naomi tries to calm him down, explaining that maybe they can return once she finishes her album, though Dylan insists he doesn't like being there. The situation becomes tense when they go outside, and Dylan tries to interact with a goat named Samus. Suddenly, the animal turns aggressive and bites the boy, forcing Naomi to rush him to the hospital. There, while a nurse finishes bandaging Dylan's wound, Naomi runs into Grayson, an old acquaintance. He comes over to say hello, mentioning he'd heard she was back in town and wanted to see the local rock legend. Grayson notices Naomi's stress and asks what happened, to which she responds in frustration that the goat attacked her son. Grayson is kind, offering his support for anything they might need and offering his condolences for her father's death, remembering him as a good man. Back home, Naomi tries to get back to normal by giving Dylan piano lessons. During the lesson, she teaches him about the tritone, a chord that, she explains, was once forbidden by the church because they believed it incited people to do crazy things. Dylan, showing childish curiosity, wants to play something forbidden, but Naomi decides it's time for bed. Before sleeping, Dylan asks his mother to check his room because he heard noises the night before. Naomi tries to rationalize his fears, explaining that the house is old and makes noises, and teaches him a little trick to face his fears. If something can be touched, it is real, but monsters cannot be touched because they are only in his head. Dylan then asks about his late grandfather, and if it is true they will see him again. Naomi tenderly tells him that if he closes his eyes and thinks of him, he can see him whenever he wants. That night, Naomi decides to listen to the tape her father left. She listens attentively to Arthur's confession about the murder of Royce Cobb and the warning about the rats as a sign that the danger has returned. Arthur mentions in the recording that God promised not to use floods or plagues, but recalls that when he was young, they flooded the town and he came for them. Naomi is disturbed by the information. Shortly after, Dylan begins to behave strangely. He wakes up confused, saying the bathroom doesn't look like the bathroom and that he feels something isn't right in his brain, describing sensations that feel weird and foreign to him. Naomi tries to reassure him and gives him a whistle, promising that if he uses it, she will come immediately. The next day, during breakfast, Dylan asks his mother directly if something bad happened in that house, as he feels stranger every day. Naomi asks him to tell her about anything weird he feels. The conversation takes a disturbing turn when Dylan makes a comment about killing in a video game, and when scolded, he responds with unusual coldness, asking his mother if she would like him to kill her. Upset and worried, Naomi sends him to the school bus, but is left thinking about her son's strange attitude and her father's words on the tape about how that evil entity came for them after the flood. Later, Naomi tries to cheer Dylan up by taking him out for ice cream. She apologizes for the morning argument and assures him that things will get better. However, Dylan tells her that a classmate named Nathan told him terrible things about California, claiming it is a horrible place where people go to hell. Naomi defends her old home, telling him that Nathan doesn't know what he's talking about. At that moment, in the parking lot, a strange woman points at them and screams repeatedly, "It's you!" Naomi is left bewildered, not knowing if the woman refers to her or her son, while the stranger keeps screaming before the situation calms down. That same night, Naomi wakes up after dozing off in front of the TV and discovers Dylan downstairs, in a trance-like state, playing with a lamp. When she approaches, the boy mutters that it's Cobb and that he is the one doing it. Alarmed by the mention of the name from her father's tape, Naomi decides to contact Grayson and invites him to dinner to talk. During dinner, Naomi opens up to him about recent tragedies, telling him how her husband and father-in-law died in a car accident that seemed like a cruel coincidence of fate. She confesses that she no longer sees these things as signs from God, but as the randomness of a world without control. Finally, Naomi reveals to Grayson what really has her terrified. She found a tape where her father confesses to killing Royce Cobb. She explains that since they returned to the house, inexplicable things have been happening, from her own strange dreams to Dylan's regressive and disturbing behavior. Grayson, although skeptical at first and suggesting it could be stress, agrees to investigate Cobb to see if there is any real connection or if the man is still alive. The next day, Grayson returns with news. He has discovered that Cobb's daughter has been speaking publicly about her father's disappearance for years, complaining that the police never did anything. Grayson informs Naomi that the woman is outside in his car and they can talk to her right now to get answers. Llewellyn continues her story with an intensity that makes Naomi uncomfortable, describing how her father, Royce Cobb, seemed divided into two distinct people. She explains that the dark version of him constantly muttered about an outstanding debt and a name, Piper. According to her, her father believed someone or something was coming to collect what was owed, and that obsession led him to perform macabre rituals with animals near the water, as if he were being forced by an external force. Llewellyn warns Naomi that this thing didn't disappear with her father's death, but is like a black energy that remains soaked into the earth, waiting for its next victim. Before leaving, she makes it clear that if they are experiencing strange things in the house, it is no coincidence, and that they should be very careful, because evil never forgets a debt. Naomi and Grayson are left processing the information, trying to connect the dots between Arthur's confession on the tape and Llewellyn's story. However, their conversation is interrupted by an urgent call from Dylan's school. The principal asks Naomi to go immediately, using a tone that suggests something serious has happened. Upon arriving at the principal's office, he shows her a disturbing photograph on his phone. He explains that Dylan brought something to class for show and tell, something that horrified the other children and the teacher, the severed head of Samus the goat. The principal informs her that, due to the gravity of the incident and Dylan's maladjusted behavior, they are seriously considering expulsion, although for now, it will only be a suspension while they evaluate the child's psychological state. The drive back home is tense and silent. Naomi, trying to maintain her composure, gently asks Dylan where he found the animal's head. The boy, with blood-curdling calmness, replies that he found it in the woods, separated from the body. Naomi tries to find out if he hurt the goat, but Dylan insists it was already like that. However, what he says next is what truly terrifies his mother. He confesses that he loved Samus so much he wanted to keep her face so he could look at it whenever he wanted. That statement, spoken without remorse or empathy, confirms for Naomi that something very dark is influencing her son's mind. That night, the atmosphere in the house becomes even more oppressive. Naomi enters Dylan's room and discovers a series of new drawings scattered on the floor. They aren't normal childish scribbles. They are dark, violent depictions of elongated figures and faces without eyes. When she asks about them, Dylan mentions naturally that the man tells him how to draw. With her heart racing, Naomi asks who that man is. Dylan replies that it is her grandfather's friend, the one who came with the flood, and that sometimes he stands in the corner of the room to watch him sleep. Terrified by the idea that someone or something is entering her son's room, Naomi decides to spend the night there with him, watching the door in the gloom, although exhaustion eventually overcomes her. The next morning, Naomi wakes up with a start and discovers Dylan is not in bed. Panic seizes her until she confirms the boy has taken the school bus. Grayson arrives shortly after, and Naomi, feeling she can no longer hide anything, decides to show him everything she has found. She confesses that she lied about not knowing where Cobb's body was and takes him to the spot in the woods where she suspects her father buried the evidence. However, upon digging, they don't find a body, but something stranger. A mark carved into an old tree that looks like the number 13 or an ancient symbol. Naomi remembers that her father, Arthur, built the house himself and was very meticulous with details. Grayson suggests that perhaps the number and the location aren't random. They return to the house and pull out the original construction blueprints. By superimposing the location of the marked tree over the property design, Naomi realizes it forms part of a geometric pattern. Remembering her basic geometry lessons, she traces lines connecting the key points of the property and discovers that they all converge at a specific spot inside the house, the dead center of the dining room. Wasting no time, they move the table and pry up the floorboards at the indicated spot. There, hidden in the darkness of the foundation, they find a rusty metal box and the old St. Christopher medallion Naomi thought she had lost in childhood. Grayson comments that St. Christopher is the protector of travelers and, in some traditions, protects children against evil. But the most macabre find is inside the box. They discover human bones. It isn't a complete skeleton, but fragments that have been cleaned and marked with strange letters. When arranging the bones on the floor, the letters spell out a name Grayson recognizes from his local research: Harling. Grayson explains to Naomi that Harling is a man who lives on the outskirts of town, a former seminarian who studied with her father but left the church to follow a more mystical and, rumor has it, somewhat crazy path. They believe he might be the key to understanding who Piper really is and why Arthur had Cobb's bones, if they are indeed his, marked with that name. But before going to find Harling, they decide to show the evidence to Officer Armas, hoping the police will finally intervene. Officer Armas listens to the story and looks at the tape, but remains skeptical of supernatural theories. He confirms that Cobb was a known criminal, and his disappearance was a relief to many, but he doesn't seem willing to reopen a case based on ghost stories and old bones without forensic analysis that will take weeks. He warns them not to get into trouble and asks them to leave the investigation to the professionals, dismissing them with a condescending attitude. That night, the house seems to take on a life of its own. While Naomi tries to process the uselessness of the police, her laptop turns on by itself, broadcasting static at a deafening volume. Suddenly, the sound of her father's tape is heard, but it's not coming from the recorder. It seems to resonate from the walls themselves, amplified and distorted. The sound of frenzied scratching erupts in the ceiling as if thousands of claws were trying to tear their way through from the attic. Naomi runs upstairs, screaming Dylan's name. Upon reaching the attic, the scene is a nightmare come true. She finds her son standing in the center of the room in a state of absolute trance. But he is not alone. The floor, the beams, and the walls are covered by a living carpet of rats moving frantically around the boy without touching him, as if they were worshiping or protecting him. On the back wall, illuminated by a flickering light, is the severed goat head crudely mounted, presiding over the scene like a profane idol. Naomi tries to move toward her son, but the rotting wooden floor gives way beneath her feet, trapping her partially while the rats begin to lunge at her. Fighting against panic and disgust, Naomi manages to free herself and drag Dylan out of that rodent hell. Grayson arrives the next morning. After Naomi tells him what happened that night, Grayson responds that they cannot stay there another minute and suggests they stay at a motel for the day. Naomi, now convinced they are facing something beyond human understanding, knows there is only one person who might have the answers. She tells Grayson to forget the police. They have to contact Harling immediately because the entity is no longer hiding and is hunting Dylan. Naomi and Grayson locate Harling, who turns out to be an intense and direct man. Naomi wastes no time and tells him everything she has discovered. Her father's confession on the tape, the bones found under the house, and the name Piper that seems to be at the center of it all. Upon hearing the details, Harling finally decides to reveal the dark truth that has been buried in the town for decades. He explains that in the 50s, the authorities decided to flood the valley where the poor people lived to build the lake. They promised them new land for relocation, but they lied and left them with nothing. Harling recounts that a man who sold ice cream from a truck lived in that valley. The children followed him everywhere, and they nicknamed him Piper. This man, seeking revenge for the town's betrayal, lured 5 children into his home to wait for the flood, planning for them to die, one for every acre of land he had been falsely promised. 3 of those children drowned when the waters rose, but 2 managed to escape. Those 2 survivors were Royce Cobb and Arthur, Naomi's father. The revelation hits Naomi as Harling continues explaining that years later, Cobb sought out Arthur because he felt something evil was taking control of him, forcing him to hurt animals and do dark things. Arthur, seeing that his friend was being consumed by Piper's vengeful spirit, killed him believing it would stop the infection and protect the others. However, Harling warns that the blood debt was not paid. Since 2 children escaped that time, Piper's spirit has returned to claim what he believes is owed to him, 2 children to complete his revenge. At that moment, the situation becomes critical when Llewellyn appears on Naomi's property, screaming defiantly at the house that she isn't afraid and giving thanks that the truth about her father has come to light. But the tension spikes dramatically when Naomi receives a call from the school. The secretary informs her that Dylan never arrived at his classroom, even though Naomi watched him enter the building that morning. Desperate, she contacts Officer Armas, who confirms that not only has Dylan disappeared, but also his classmate Nathan, the boy who was bullying him. Armas tries to rationalize the situation, suggesting they ran away together, but warns them to stop talking about curses. Naomi knows she has no time for police bureaucracy. Harling arrives at the house ready to intervene, stating that the church has no authority here and direct faith is needed to face what is happening. He explains to Naomi that the spirit has taken the children to his own place of residence, a spiritual dimension where he repeats his final moments. To save Dylan, Harling tells Naomi she must undergo an ancient and dangerous baptism, not symbolic, but literal. She must be submerged in the water to the very limit of death so that God can bring her back, allowing her to cross to the other side to find her son. Without hesitation, Naomi walks into the lake with Harling and Grayson assisting her. She is submerged into the freezing waters, and on the threshold between life and death. She has a vision of her late husband, John. He speaks to her sweetly, telling her that Dylan needs her and that she must fight through the pain to save him. Driven by these words, Naomi emerges in an alternate reality, a dark and distorted version of the woods where she finds Piper's original house, which should have been destroyed by the flood. Naomi enters the ruined house and finds Dylan and the other boy, Nathan, but Piper, the dark entity, manifests violently to stop her. A physical and spiritual struggle breaks out in which Naomi, remembering her husband's words and moved by the fury of protecting her son, manages to confront the spirit. In the chaos, she succeeds in freeing the children from Piper's influence and escaping that dimension. In the real world, Grayson and Harling pull Naomi's body from the water and manage to revive her. The next morning, everything seems to have returned to calm. Dylan acts like a normal child, and the nightmare appears to be over. However, Harling has a final chilling conversation with Grayson. He explains that Arthur made a fundamental error in his theory. He believed adults couldn't be controlled by Piper because they needed to be closer to evil. But the truth is much worse. Harling has realized that Piper used the children only as a means, but his true goal was to get an adult, as an adult functions as a much more powerful antenna to transmit his signal and his will. Harling reflects on the legend of the Pied Piper, suggesting that perhaps the true cruelty wasn't killing the children, but leaving them alive without their parents, creating a world of suffering orphans. As Harling reaches this terrible conclusion, we see Naomi step out onto the porch. Her gaze has changed, she is no longer herself. Dylan calls her repeatedly, "Mom, Mom," but she doesn't answer. Naomi begins to sing the hymn, "Down to the River to Pray," with a clear and disturbing voice. Under Piper's total control, Naomi walks toward the lake with a serene and terrible authority. The townspeople, mesmerized by her singing and presence, begin to follow her in a procession. The movie ends with Naomi guiding everyone into the water, determined to drown them in the depths to fulfill the entity's dark purpose, finally answering Harling's question about whether God is always on one side with a devastating silence as everyone descends into the river.